mouse.
This room needs a clock.
Okay. So when I was asked to speak 10 minutes, I said I'm going to talk about groundwater droughts because no one knows anything about it anyway, so I should be wrapped up in 5. So let me start off and talk about, of course, we're pretty familiar with droughts in Texas. We've had some rains recently, and you think that the drought is gone. But if you look at the very recent drought monitor, this is from the last week, October 1st, right here. Still, a significant portion of West Texas is still considered to be under drought. I mean, we're still recovering from what happened in 2011 when, almost the entire state was in drought, or all of the state was in drought. So traditional response to droughts have always been, let's go build more surface water reservoirs. I mean, when we had the drought of 50s, that was our worst drought, worst drought on record. We started doing a state water plan, and the Texas said, let's go build as many reservoirs as possible. Now we want about $2 million from a rainy day fund to help us combat drought. So it's somewhat ironic, but and what do we want to do? We want to build 22 more reservoirs. So our typical approach has always been, let's go look for more surface water sources. There are some legal reasons for that because surface water is owned by the state. So that's been the largest user. But increasingly, there is a greater reliance on groundwater resources of late. So, how does drought affect groundwater? What is the effect on groundwater is what I like to study, okay? Groundwater is not well understood. That's because of many things. One, when you have a drought, surface water, you see lakes drying up and people say, oh my God, there's a drought. And groundwater, who knows? As long as the well water flows out of the well, you don't worry about it. So that's one issue. There's been some studies. What we typically see on the watershed scale is when you have a flooding, the water quickly dissipates out. Like the water enters the aquifer, but it's quickly dissipated out through streams and creeks and so on. But recovery from a drought, particularly for aquifers, is very, very slow. It can take several years. Okay. Drought signature tends to be pretty attenuated in the aquifer, so aquifers are low-pass filters. Karst aquifers, of course, are some notable exceptions. We have one of those in Texas. So the big question is, how do groundwater systems respond to drought? Well, there is the reduced supply because there is less recharge happening to the aquifer, at least in some aquifers, and there is an increased demand, both from anthropogenic pumping as well as groundwater evapotranspiration. So how can we detect droughts, or what is the hydrologic signal of a meteorological drought on groundwater systems is what I look at. So if we look at Texas, okay, and I'm plotting here the Palmer Drought Index against groundwater use in Texas over the last 30 years or so. What we see is on an average, or at least on an average, our groundwater use goes down, which is a good thing. I mean, we are conserving water during periods of drought, which is a good thing. But if I look at the surface water to groundwater ratios, under wet and normal years, it tends to be less than 1. So there's a greater reliance on surface water during wet periods or normal periods. But that flips when we get into drought. So during dry periods, we have a greater reliance on drought. So groundwater, as economists would like to say, has a buffer value. In other words, we tend to rely on it a little bit more when we get into dry spells. Okay, so this is the 2011 to 2010 comparison. There was a 30% increase in the amount of groundwater that we use. Where did all that water go? Mostly into municipal and agricultural sectors. So they used a lot more groundwater. Our first, as I said, in the 50s, when we did the drought of records, our approach was let's build surface waters. When we had the 2011 drought, most cities are now saying, let's look at groundwater to improve our resilience for drought. So Midland has a T-Bar Ranch project, like in the city of Lubbock is buying water from Roberts County Wellfield. City of San Antonio has a Vista Verde project. So you can't really think of a city that doesn't use groundwater these days or not contemplating and looking at groundwater to improve their drought resilience. So let's see what kind of a response you will see in aquifer. So I'll first take you to South Texas, right by Corpus Christi, the Mission Aransas Bay. It's a very pristine watershed called Mission River Watershed. There's very little development, so the climate signals, it's a good place to look for climate signals rather than, because most of the times those signals are confounded by urbanization. So What I'm showing here there is September 2003. 2003 was a normal year there, or what is, the rainfall was pretty typical of that place. The base flow recession curve in September, or what happens to that stream after a few rainfall events that we get in July, what you see is the typical base flow is about 10 to 15 CFS. So this is the water that groundwater is discharging into these streams. September 2004, a large year. There were a couple of hurricanes that went through in the Gulf of Atlantic, so we had fairly large base flows. September 2011, the streak went dry. 2012, 2013, it hasn't recovered. So you see that asymmetric response I'm talking about, so they don't recover back as quickly because the water level is now low, and the stream has turned from being a gaining stream, which is to get water from the groundwater, to a losing stream that's essentially losing water whenever it floods. The best place to study droughts are in karst formations. I'll take you to Edwards Aquifer next. And I'm looking at spring flows in San Marcos. So San Marcos Springs is a discharge of Edwards Aquifer. Edwards Aquifer is a large limestone aquifer. Perfect correlations, great place to study drought. I mean, the signature or the response is really quick. So there are some aquifers which respond very quickly to droughts, and Edwards is one of them. Finally, I'll take us back to Ogallala. This is a clastic formation or a sand and gravel formation, very deep. What type of a signature do we see? This is a well hydrograph or the water level fluctuations. That was the 2011 year 2011. Really, you can't tell much in terms of what the aquifer is doing under drought. Is it even responding? And those are some of the questions. So if you want to look at time, if you want to look against drought indicators, is there a trend? Well, I would say no. You can't see much of a trend. So is this aquifer really buffered up? If we flip this and look at the frequency spectrum as opposed to looking at time, if you start mining that data a little bit, what we start seeing is towards the very end or towards the low frequency spectrum, the signature starts to look alike. Or you start to see a little bit more of a correlation at very low frequencies. So there is a drought signal embedded in there, or a persistent drought signal embedded in there that requires a little bit of teasing out, so it's just not, it doesn't manifest as quickly in some of these aquifers. Of course, I'm looking at, tail end of Ogallala where the aquifer is fairly shallow. If I start moving up to Roberts County where the aquifer is about 1,000 feet deep, it has to be a much higher persistent drought before we can tease these effects out. So this aquifer essentially acts like a low-pass filter. In other words, any short-term droughts get washed out by this aquifer. Whereas the long-term signatures are present in it, it just takes a lot more effort to start seeing the effects of drought. So to kind of summarize, aquifer response to droughts vary widely depending on what you do. It's conditioned by heterogeneity within the aquifer. So you have the meteorologic variability and the aquifer heterogeneity added together, makes for a perfect mix to see if we can even detect drought. So obviously there is a need for high resolution monitoring data. This is happening quite a bit. There is a lot more of automated data loggers that are coming into play over the last 10 years or so. So if we wait for another 10, 20 years towards the end of my career, we'll have the perfect data set to start looking for droughts. The best places to characterize groundwater droughts or the groundwater effects are where the groundwater meets the land surface. So spring flows, riparian areas, you can clearly see signatures of drought in the short term. If you have a very persistent drought, you can actually see that in aquifers, deeper aquifers like Ogallala, which we're here. But we do need better algorithms, so there's a big role for computer scientists, to help us, or signal enhancement techniques that electrical engineers use. We use some very similar techniques to tease out what droughts look like. So that's kind of my short talk on droughts. I'll be happy to answer any questions or.
Maybe our first presenter who went under 10 minutes.
There we go.
Are there any questions or topics for discussion?
Yeah. A quick one. When
Sure.
do you envision, say, a karst aquifer with high groundwater and stream flow connections to be able to be used as part of?
We actually use it in Edwards. Yeah, in Edwards Aquifer we do use it because when the water level drops below a certain level, there are some endangered species that get affected. So there is a big push from the federal, endangered species.
Put it into our planning process.
In the karst aquifer, it is put into the planning process. It is not done as much in other aquifers because they tend to see it more like, if I have a drought, I'll pull into groundwater, which is not a good thing to do. There are signatures, so people have to understand that aquifers also respond to drought, albeit a little slowly, but you can't start mining an aquifer just because you're in drought. That creates problems. Right? Yeah. Question, John?
Do aquifers really around this part of the country, such as the Ogallala, really go back to some equilibrium?
We have stressed it so much. If you're willing to wait for hundreds of years without pumping, cease pumping now and then wait for centuries, it might, but in all practicality, no, we will not. The response of Ogallala, particularly in kind of aquifer, is highly nonlinear. So if you had stressed it little, it'll go back to equilibrium quickly. But if you're down to the last 20, 30 feet of your saturated thicknesses, it's a nonlinear hysteretic curve. So in theory you can, but I don't think it'll happen. So.
Any other questions? All right, thank you.
All right, great. Thanks.